Good morning and welcome to today's on Zoom. Okay, you're connecting to Zoom. Let me know then. I think you could do this. Right. Good morning and welcome to today's Policy Roundtable, Amplifying Voices, Why a Feminist Foreign Policy Matters for the Global South and North. My name is Karen Johnston. I'm the Research Director and Senior Fellow at Women in International Security, pronounced WISE. Our President and CEO, Ariela Bleta, was unable to make it this morning. It's flu season, so she will be with us over Zoom, and we hope that Zoe gets better. And welcome to all of you, both here in person, which is such a pleasure, and also to those on Zoom. We are looking forward to a wonderful discussion. And let me give you a little information about WISE. WISE is a non-governmental organization that promotes gender equality by helping women advance as leaders in the international peace and security sector. For 35 years, our unique global organization has supported professional growth opportunities for women, led gender equality research projects and policy engagement initiatives, and nurtured a community of powerful security advocates, expert leaders, and mentors. Our network spans nearly 50 countries across 6 continents and includes 15,000 members who are committed to closing the gender gap worldwide. WISE is pleased to be partnering with the Heinrich Böll Foundation in hosting today's events to highlight the Foundation's Feminist Foreign Development Policy Fellowship. 8 young professionals are in Washington this week, 2 of whom will be part of today's panel discussion. Our event today will focus on the topic of feminist foreign policy. 2022 has been a turbulent year, from the current protests in Iran, the war in Ukraine, and the ever-present long-term effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Gender equality remains under threat. This conversation comes at a critical time. Sweden was the first country in 2014 to commit itself to a feminist foreign policy. And yet, in October, Sweden's new minority coalition government, backed by the far-right Sweden Democrats Party, announced it will abandon that country's feminist foreign policy. Meanwhile, in the last 2 years, the governments of Germany, Mexico, Libya, and Chile have each announced their intent to pursue a feminist foreign policy. Chile has been at the forefront in support of gender equality and the women, peace, and security agenda, and now with its commitment to a feminist foreign policy. Earlier this year, Chilean Foreign Minister Antonia Urrejola announced that feminist foreign policy would be the hallmark of Chile's diplomacy efforts. Today, we have the distinct honor of hearing from His Excellency Sebastian Kraljevic, permanent representative of Chile to the Organization of American States. Ambassador Kraljevic was appointed permanent representative of Chile to the Organization of American States in April 2022. Prior to his appointment, he was an electoral strategist, developing public opinion analyses and designing and implementing strategies for electoral campaigns, governments, agencies, and organizations. He has taught at several universities, serving as a guest professor for different institutions, including the UNESCO chair, the UNAM of Mexico, the University of Chile. Since 2013, he has served as an adjunct professor for the Masters of Political Science program at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. Sorry. He holds a degree in sociology from the University of Chile and a master's degree in political management from George Washington University. So we welcome back the ambassador to Washington. We are so very pleased that you can join us. Mr. Ambassador, I will turn it over to you and look forward to hearing your remarks. Thank you. Yes, please.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your invitation to share our tragic experience as a country with a feminist foreign policy. As Karen said, now. It's a tough experience because it's been only 7 months since we began working in this aspiration. Let me start by answering why Chile chose a feminist foreign policy. For us, a foreign policy oriented to gender equality is an expression of our commitment as a government to apply a gender perspective to all public policies, not just the traditional women issues, as is called for decades. In our country, a feminist foreign policy is not an isolated idea. President Boric's government is part of a broader process of changes Chile has faced in recent years. In this process of changes, among all progressive agendas, the public research shows that changes in gender and environmental matters are the topics that have a broader consensus in our society. Thus, National Precisely we aspire to be a feminist government, as we used to say on the campaign trail in 2021. This process of change and the government's commitment is the context where we have this affirmation to pursue a feminist foreign policy as a new paradigm that conducts our efforts in a short and long term with careful. First, a solid commitment to respect, defend, and promote human rights, because we believe that women's rights are human rights. Second, the understanding that inequities are deeply rooted in social structures. So in the international arena, Chile wants to work to identify causes and issues where we can challenge and transform the status quo. Third, intersectionality and a cross-sectional approach, because our foreign policy recognizes and works to transform discrimination and inequalities affecting women and girls in all their diversity. Let me include a brief footnote in this phrase. Women and girls in all their diversity is probably the most disputed and negotiated phrase in the Inter-American system this year. Why? Because some countries with conservative governments fear that all the diversity opens the door to discussing who a woman is. What we are learning in this process of pursuing feminist foreign policy? First, feminist foreign policy must be a relevant criterion for decision making. It should impact nominations, multilateral negotiation, priorities, and more. Second, principles of equity and non-discrimination must be at the core of all our foreign policy. So we need to rethink in every issue how our work can contribute to eliminating any obstacle to the entire exercise of autonomy and human rights by women and girls in all their diversity. This is a challenging process, of course, but we're achieving some things. For instance, Chilean women ambassadors went from 14 in last year to 24 now. However, after this expansion, they represent just 28% of our ambassadors. Second, a compelling Spanish language issue, maybe not clear understanding from the English, but since last April, our female colleagues can use their titles, grades, and studies in the feminine form, which was forbidden until then. Chilean diplomats also now have training in feminism, gender inequalities, and feminist foreign policy. And we are working hard with civil society, diplomats, academia, and key stakeholders to present our first feminist foreign policy action plan in March 2023. What's next for us? Some critical issues from a global South perspective framework. First, improve cooperation and coordination for an inclusive post-pandemic recovery in Latin America. In our region, as you know, women are the most affected by poverty, financial exclusion, and the burden of family care. Second, action against gender-based violence. Empower an international and normative framework with the Inter-American Commission of Women, the CIM, and the Belém do Pará Convention. And third, work in the issue of human rights and environment, expanding and empowering the Escazú Agreement in a region where most human rights and environmental defenders are women. As you can see, we are just beginning this challenge of a feminist foreign policy, working hard and eager to learn and contribute to gender equality in Chile, the region, and the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. It is so important to, in the context of this wonderful opportunity with the fellows and the fellowship, to talk about feminist foreign policy, both from a global South and a global North perspective, which is the focus of our discussion. So we're very happy and pleased to have had the comments that you've made to give us a perspective and sort of launching point for which we will now have our discussion. But before we do that, I would like to call on Teresa Ada from the Bird Foundation to talk about not only just introducing the foundation to those of you who may not know it, but also their wonderful new fellowship on feminist foreign policy and development. Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Ambassador, for your words, and thank you to WISE for hosting us this morning. I'll keep it very brief because I don't want to take away from the conversation that we're about to have. Just very briefly, I'm with the Heinrich Böll Foundation. It's a political foundation. Germany has a system where each political party has its own foundation affiliated with them. And so we are affiliated with the German Green Party, but our funds come out of the ministries, the German ministries for foreign affairs and for development. And Germany announced in 2021, as most of you know, that it would adopt a feminist foreign policy, which is this effort is spearheaded by the foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock. And we as a foundation thought this is the opportunity for us to also contribute to shaping this feminist foreign policy in Germany, which is why we set up this great fellowship and invited young feminists from the global South and North to have a dialogue about what it actually means to have a feminist foreign policy, how to implement it, and how to communicate it effectively. And they joined us on Sunday. We've already had a ton of meetings the last couple of days. We visited the IMF, we visited the World Bank, we visited Howard University, USAID. Today we're going to the State Department to also get the American perspective on this topic. And I think it's fair to say the things that we've discussed over and over again are that, you know, if Germany wants to implement a feminist foreign policy, it really needs to listen to those who are going to be affected by that policy. So specifically women in the global South. We also discussed a lot how a feminist foreign policy is not just about women and girls. It is so much more. It's a shift in focus on more on human security. It's here to dismantle the power structures that have held back a substantial part of the population for so long. So I'll just keep it at that, and I hope you all can talk to our fellows after this event as well, where we have a little networking lunch, but I'll give it back to you, Karen, to start the conversation.
Thank you, Teresa. So let me do a few introductions for our panelists. First of all, thank you very much for coming, especially in person. It's wonderful that we have that opportunity. And so let me begin by going sort of from my right to my left. Tara Demand is the Interim National Director of Programs, Advocacy, and Government Affairs at Amnesty USA. Tara brings over 20 years of experience in global gender issues and has advocated for human rights at the United Nations, the White House, State Department, Department of Defense, USAID, Capitol Hill, and with many foreign governments. In addition to her leadership of the programs team and government relations and advocacy team, she heads the organization's work on women's rights, LGBTI rights, and the indigenous people's rights and sexual and reproductive rights. She holds a PhD in English and a graduate certificate in women, gender, and sexuality studies. Her analysis has been featured in the New York Times, CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, Time, and many other media outlets. Thank you. Hilary Anderson, thank you for coming. Yes, is the Senior Gender Specialist for the Inter-American Commission of Women at the Organization of American States, focusing on women's rights and gender equality issues in Latin America. Since finishing her studies in gender and development at McGill University in Montreal, Hilary has worked with the Pan American Health Organization's Gender and Health Unit and with the United Nations International Research and Training Institute for the Advancement of Women. In her current position, she has led development of knowledge and capacity building tools to close the gap between the international legal framework on women's rights and national level laws and policies. Thank you. And to my left here, Fakriya,
Fakriya.
my apologies, Fakriya Hashim is a development and policy communications consultant whose work focuses exclusively on socially conscious and SDG, ESG-backed projects. She was a research fellow on the Peace, Security and Development Fellowship Program at the African Leadership Center, King's College London. She holds a bachelor's degree in finance from Abu Dhabi University and a master's degree in emerging economies and inclusive development from King's College London. She has previously worked for NetTech for IT solutions in the UAE and girl-child concerns in the conflict-ridden Borno state, as well as in the Nigerian vice presidency on the monitoring and evaluation team for social protection programs. Thank you for coming. And Sophia Sefcu is a Brussels-based independent researcher, analyst, and project manager with more than 6 years of experience in foreign policy and diplomacy, with a particular focus on gender, environment, security, and a nexus between them and the EU, NATO, and Central and Eastern Europe. She previously worked as a researcher and project manager on topics related to feminist foreign policy, WPS agenda, and climate diplomacy for Dr. Hannah Neumann, who is a member of the European Parliament, and at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. She is an alumna of the EU International Relations and Diplomacy Studies program at the College of Europe and holds a master's in science and conflict and development from Ghent University. Thank you all for coming. And we will have our speakers respond to several questions. And each panelist will have about 3 or 5 minutes to respond to it. And then we will open our discussion to the individuals here, the audience in person, and from those participating on Zoom. And so if I may just pose the first question, feminist foreign policy has received a lot of criticism. It's not well defined, and there is no standard blueprint on how to implement it. One of the most substantive criticisms is that feminist foreign policy is Western-centric and lacks an intersectional lens. How can we combat these often valid criticisms while also not falling into the trap of seeking a one-size-fits-all global solution? And if I may start with Sophia.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador, as well for your speech, and thank you for having us today. Thank you for amazing introduction of my bio. One thing that wasn't mentioned is probably that I'm Ukrainian. So today I'm going to probably share a bit more personal story of the war that is happening in my country rather than going and boring you with too many terms and discussions. I assume you all here are aware of what is feminist foreign policy from a very theoretical point of view. And if not, I'm sure Wise Global and other chapters have a lot of theoretical papers on that. So I'm going to talk about and take you to the 21st of February when the war started in my country, or even a bit earlier, when there were a lot of discussions online and spreading the news around that what is happening in Ukraine, how Ukrainians are going to respond to what's happening, how Ukraine is not going to survive for more than 3 days and the country is going to fall. And most of those things were coming from foreign analysts, the experts in military, the people who have been doing security and defense for the past 20, 30 decades. And yet today we're in a very different reality. Yet today my country is resistant. The people are taking back the lands that were taken in the beginning. And we see bright Ukrainian women and men who are fighting back. And I think with this, I want to show as well, why is it important to have dialogues like this? And why is it important to have people from the ground join in this type of discussion? And why maybe there is no blueprint for feminist foreign policy and feminist development policy, and why each country's experience is indeed different. After the war started, I have also been reading, and I mean, a lot of Ukrainians were in shock, and we had to deal with a lot of day-to-day chores when helping our country fundraising. So we didn't really have time to provide expertise on issues like women, peace and security, and feminist foreign policy was not the first thing on my mind when I would wake up in the morning. And And yet, once I was able to cope with my emotions and I went to read the news, I saw that there were articles emerging, mostly indeed, again, by foreign analysts. And one of the ideas were, is it okay to send weapons to Ukraine? If we talk about feminist foreign policy, women, peace and security, the idea is disarmament, peace building. Let's just make it calm and then the peace is going to come. And yet it's very different reality if you live in Ukraine, if you know Ukrainian history, if you were to talk to my grandmother, my great-grandmother who lived through the war in the Second World War and who knew that it's not going to happen. Even if Ukraine is not going to fight back and there will be no weapons and the peace will not come like this. And I think this type of stories you can know only by talking to people and only by engaging with the society on the ground. Even me sitting today, I still feel like I'm not entitled to talk on behalf of all Ukrainians because I have been living in Belgium for the past 4 years and before I lived in other countries. So I'm not in my country for 8 years, even though my family is all there. So I kind of stay connected. I read the news. But just to give you some numbers, today we have around 50,000 women who joined Ukrainian armed forces and who serve at the front line. We have around 10 million women who are internally displaced, and we have roughly the same type of number who are externally displaced and are right now all over the world. We have 6 million people who returned to Ukraine since 24th February, so the ones who left and now came back and continuing their lives. And there are many, many more numbers I can name, but this is also try to understand all those experiences of women are very different. The ones who are right now in the east of Ukraine, where the military forces are happening, the ones who are in the west of Ukraine, where Russia sends missiles and who might not have electricity, light, water. I have friends who have small kids and who need to be bringing up those kids without water, electricity, light, and not knowing what's happening. We have women who live abroad, and it might seem that their life is already by now sorted, but not again, because they also have very much different experiences by trying to take care of kids living in countries where they do not speak the language, where they might not be understanding the whole system, and where the support as well is falling down recently. So this is just, and I speak only about women. Feminist foreign policy is much more than only women. It's also about men, it's also about disabled people, it's also about LGBTIQ people, it's also about people of color. And coming back to the news, probably if you type in the news Ukrainian women today, you would see a beautiful face of blonde women with blue eyes. And I think that's what everyone thought as well before the 21st February. But our country is very much diverse and we have a huge variety of different people living there. And I think that's also something that you could know only by talking to people who live in Ukraine and who have been experiencing this into their everyday life. So yeah, this is a little bit about Ukraine and why probably one way does not fit everyone. And yet on the positive side, and I have shared already with some fellows as we were having different meetings, I do think that feminist foreign policy is the good response to the situations like we're having right now in Ukraine. And it's also one of the good events to see why so far we have not really been implementing and doing enough in the area of feminist foreign policy. We're very much lost in trying to define what it is and what does it mean and trying to understand the terms and norms and practices. And yet when conflicts like this happen, women, peace and security, feminist foreign policy is probably not the first thing we think about, which I think is not always correct. And indeed, because of the fact that the whole diversity in the country is showing that we need to think of that first, and it should be somewhere already in the back of your mind when you go and you respond to a conflict. And my last sentence would be probably, if there were feminist foreign policy, I think that war in Ukraine would not happen, because feminist foreign policy is about centering human beings, and this is not what what the Russian government have been doing, both to Ukrainians as well as to their own people, as well as the response to the war in Ukraine. I think seeing right now G7, G20, the leaders out there and the discussions, I don't know what they are talking about behind the scenes, but I'm pretty sure they're not talking about those women I have been talking about to you before. I'm pretty sure that their discussions are about economics, about energy security, about the money which are being lost due to the fact that the war in Ukraine is happening, but surely not about those human beings who are there. And I think maybe if we shift a bit the focus, or we were privileged to shift this focus, we would live in a different reality today. Thank you.
Thank you as well. I may turn to Maria,
Yeah.
and thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for having us on the panel today. So to answer or to attempt to answer the question on the feminist policy, feminist foreign policy design in relation to this global north-south divide, I think I guess one of the most important things when it comes to the foreign policy on like a more broader level is that policies that originate from the north often do tend to not have insights or contributions from the global south. I would like to point out what we have seen come out of the Mexican case. The Mexican foreign ministry had also has also adopted a feminist foreign policy lens in its outlook on global policy. And one of the things that has been very visible is the asymmetry that lies on that scale. And so it is one of the very few, I think, alongside Chile and Libya, interestingly enough, it is one of the very few places in the global south that sort of reflects how other places like most of the African continent can seek to sort of understand and contextualize what feminist foreign policy means for it. So I would like to speak on 2 points on this asymmetry. At the very core of the adaptation from countries like Sweden, Canada, is that there is state commitment, there is state support, right? And this also means that the state is working hand in hand with policymakers, with the legislatives, the civil societies. So there is state backing, right, when it comes to policy articulation. And this is a major distinction between the places like Canada, for instance, and let's say Libya, right, for instance, because when we look at local realities, right, how the state responds to feminist issues like gender-based violence, gender inequality and stuff, it doesn't necessarily reflect what a state like Libya sort of projects on an international stage in its attempt to adopt this foreign policy, right? So, I mean, there lies this very vast discrepancy between what is inward and what is being portrayed outwardly. So this is one point, but there's also a lack of resources, right? Particularly for feminist groups and women organizations that are spearheading the work on formulating a very inclusive feminist foreign policy. So in places like Canada, Sweden, initially, there has been that kind of support, that kind of resourcing to bring together a lot of policymakers from different sectors, the security sector, the the social sector, even the private public sectors, to come together. And because this is something that requires a lot of resources, a lot of effort, but the lack of resources, the lack of allocating these resources in a place like Nigeria would potentially hinder, bringing together a lot of people from diverse backgrounds to have very diverse inputs to come up with a blueprint, in essence. So I think these are some of the more fundamental issues that would impact the way the global South articulates and designs, this policy, and also how that could create a lot of distinction between how the global South and the global North essentially operates.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. If I may turn to Hillary.
Yes, of course, thank you. In terms of responding to the critiques on the lack of inclusion, I think it's important to understand when we're doing a feminist foreign policy that feminism doesn't mean the same thing to every person in every space. We recently negotiated a new strategic plan for the Inter-American Commission in the multilateral American space, and we tried to insert the word feminism in a number of different lines of action, and it was roundly rejected by the majority of the OAS member states. And the arguments were varied, and they were trying to push a sexual and reproductive health and rights agenda. We're trying to exclude men and boys. We're trying to radicalize everybody. Then there are different understandings of the word feminism in different spaces. And unfortunately, the multilateral space is not really there yet in terms of adopting the word feminism in any of its negotiated agreements. In addition, I think we have a version of Northern or Western liberal feminism, if you want to call it, that doesn't necessarily mean the same that as feminism does, coming from different parts of the world. And in that case, I think the process of developing a feminist foreign policy is really important. I want to highlight specifically the Canadian case, not just because it's the one that I'm the most familiar with, but Canada, in the development of both its feminist foreign policy and its feminist international assistance policy, organized a series of discussions with what they call women's rights organizations. So they're both feminist and women's organizations that don't necessarily identify as feminists, from around the world, from all of the countries that they have development cooperation with, to hear from them what they would expect from a feminist international assistance policy and a feminist foreign policy. So that was important in terms of crafting policies that really responded to the priorities and the demands of women's organizations, above all, throughout the world. They also organized meetings with multilateral organizations. So from the OAS, we participated in meetings with the government of Canada, as did all of the United Nations entities and all of the other entities in the Inter-American system, in terms of what we would value and what we would expect from both a feminist foreign policy and a feminist international assistance policy. And certainly from our perspective, I think what we really highlighted was that countries that do have feminist foreign policies are much better at pushing forward the agenda for gender equality in the context of multilateral negotiations. So the ambassador mentioned this in his introductory remarks. We've had a particular problem with the issue of the term diversity and intersectionality in a lot of the OAS agreements over the last, I would say, 10 years. We've also had problems around terms like gender equality, as gender has been expanded to go beyond the binary that it was. It represented the binary when we negotiated gender equality agreements. For example, during the Beijing Platform for Action, it really referred to men and women. We're gradually broadening our understanding of gender, and that's a good thing, but it scares a lot of countries. So there's been some pushback on gender equality as a term in multilateral spaces as well for that reason, because just basically there's a lack of understanding, and in a lot of cases, there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation, fake news is and what it means. From a policy perspective. So I think it's important to be very clear about what we mean when we say feminism, what the goals that we're trying to achieve are. And in terms of a one-size-fits-all approach, I think it's also important to understand that through a feminist foreign policy, different countries will seek to achieve different goals. Canada, for example, or the US, if it decides to develop one, they're sort of discussing it, but they have huge international development cooperation programs. So their feminist foreign policy and their feminist international assistance policy tends to apply to those development cooperations. It was the case with Sweden as well. Whereas countries like Chile or countries like Colombia, which last month at the OAS General Assembly also announced that it would be pursuing a feminist foreign policy, it's not so much about development cooperation as it is about sort of multilateral and bilateral agreements and getting more women involved in the foreign policy space where they're still underrepresented throughout most of the world. So I think, you know, it's important that we understand that different countries come at a feminist foreign policy from different contexts and with different goals, because it is still foreign policy, and foreign policies are above all trying to advance the interests of a particular country. And I think it's important that we're realistic in that as well, that it's foreign policy, you know, it's not always development assistance policy, and they are trying to pursue their own national interests as well. So I think it's important not to generate too many expectations around foreign policy, as we're also trying to be very clear about what it is that the countries are trying to achieve.
Thank you. It was a wonderful sort of parallel and symmetry to your comments about the need to have different voices involved in these discussions. So may I turn to Tara?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question as to whether or not a feminist foreign policy is inherently Western, in some ways it's so easy to dismiss because it's such a common trope when you have folks who are people or groups or interests who are opposing human rights, who are opposing progress. Like one of the go-to arguments is this is a Western concept being imposed on non-Western spaces, whatever those definitions may be. We see that all the time in human rights discussions. I think the Swedes would be surprised to learn that they invented feminism or foreign policy and movements to better move towards gender equality. You know, in the same way that the UN is not the beginning or end of human rights, these are the things, and this is so coming at the end is both very helpful and of course very humbling. But everything that's been said is saying, you know, these are movements that are on the ground, have been doing this work. Whether or not they've tied to a certain frame, whether or not they've tied to certain language, like this is happening. And this is a way that we talk about it together and need to understand our terminologies and what we share and what we don't share and what doesn't work in local context. I think the challenge, I think it's so successful, this challenge that somehow feminist foreign policy is Western concept or human rights or whatever the progress is that is inherently tied to more rights and more equity, is because we're not doing it well enough. Like this challenge comes up because we need to be better about how we're talking about this and who is talking about this. And that means, and again, these examples are who gets to define the terms in the spaces that they'll be impacting, right? Who gets to be in these conversations, who's inviting to the table, and who's setting the table in terms of these conversations. And I think the reason we see these critiques come up over and over is because as a community that is dedicated to feminist foreign policy, which is good, we aren't actually doing a good enough job of helping make clear that this is just a conversation on top of, beside the hundreds of thousands of conversations and movements that have been pushing in their own context for what we would define as feminist foreign policy. I think part of that is our own, I'm saying we so that I don't feel quite as self-attacked, but as at least my own preciousness around the term feminism and whether or not it has to be attached to movements or foreign policy work to like count as this type of peace building or gender equity, et cetera. And I think that's a real challenge when we're trying to look at ways that we're both connected in these conversations together. So having an umbrella term like human rights or an umbrella term like feminist foreign policy is very useful, but it also then can become the end goal itself instead of the things that actually are the goal in our movements. So, you know, again, with the human rights movements all the time, we're like, the idea that human rights are Western is so bananas that it hardly bears addressing. But I think it does point out gaps in our community's way of making sure that the voices that would say like, no, we are in this context, we've been fighting for this for a long time, making sure that they're heard. And it really imposes on us, I think, a burden to make sure that this is not a one size fits all blueprints. And that is, I think it's the power of feminist foreign policy work, that it isn't, here are the 5 things you have to achieve to like get your feminist foreign policy gold star, because that is something that is prescriptive and who decides that. And I think that is then a third critique.
Thank you. Yes, very, very much the sense of trying to ensure that the voices that need to be heard are heard in the right context, in the right participation. Let's, I guess, turn to the second round of questions. Again, each panelist will have 3 to 5 minutes to respond to the question. And in the global north, the new Swedish government has taken a dramatic turn and rejected its feminist foreign policy. But the trend in the global south appears different. Mexico adopted a feminist foreign policy in 2020, and we've heard earlier this year, Chile, Libya, and now Colombia have embraced the concept of a feminist foreign policy. How might we explain this trend, if it's a trend at all? Are there differences in how a feminist foreign policy approach is perceived in the global north versus the global south? How might we sort of understand, again, some of the threads in the debate and the discussion that we've had so far? And if I could, I guess, let me turn to Hillary first then. Sure. That's all right?
Yeah, that's fine. In some cases, it's probably because it's popular to do. And Fakria, in her remarks, alluded to the case of Mexico, and that's been widely criticized because it is a feminist foreign policy where you don't necessarily have a lot of feminist public policy at the national level. And the women's movement has been extremely critical of that. Whereas in the cases of Chile and Colombia, for example, it's more of a feminist approach to government and public policy in general. So feminist foreign policy is one more arm of a feminist vision for the state, if you will, which is really not the case in Mexico. So you've had a lot of pushback from feminist and women's organizations in Mexico saying, you know, great that we have a feminist foreign policy. We have no problem with that, but what about us? Because it's not just about the women in other countries. We're having a problem here too. And that, I'm sure you've noticed the news over the last few years. There have been an awful lot of like very wide scale protests up and down the country, particularly over the issue of violence against women and femicide, but also over the issue of sexual and reproductive rights, health and rights. So I think that's important, to sort of ensuring a little consistency and coherence in the sense that it isn't just, we're not just jumping on a bandwagon because other countries are doing it, because Sweden did it, because Canada did it. And if you think it's like a quick win that we can push through Parliament or whoever has to approve these things, but that it is actually more of a comprehensive approach to public policy and to government, and that we're as interested in the women that live in our countries as we are the women that live in other countries. And it isn't just about pushing feminist language or gender equality language in international agreements. It's about having a real impact on women's lives as well in whatever countries that we seek to work with. So it's also putting our money where our mouths are in terms of, yes, we promote gender equality, we promote feminism, we promote justice, we promote human rights through our international agreements and the way we act in multilateral spaces, but also when we enter into bilateral agreements, trade agreements, or other agreements with countries, the feminist principles are also guiding those negotiations. And that was a critique that was first levied at Sweden when they adopted theirs, is that, you know, they kept selling arms to countries that have horrible track records on women's rights issues and human rights issues. And that, you know, if we have a feminist foreign policy, should it not be influencing how we interact with other countries in terms of specifically economic issues? Because we know that economic issues are always the most important ones, and that women's rights are always thrown under the bus when it comes to talking about money. But no, if we have a feminist foreign policy, we have to be consistent, both internationally and domestically, in terms of our commitment to women's rights and gender equality.
Thank you. Yes. Tara?
Sure. I mean, I'm wary of trying to identify trends in the global north, however we're defining it, or the global south, because Mexico is a very different place than Libya, and the United States is a very different place than Sweden, and at any given moment, and the Swedish government is a very different place than it was. So I'm going to sidestep that question a little bit. I do think with the question of like what we're seeing in Sweden, and I think about the US context quite a bit in this as well, is that I think one of the failures of our foreign policy work has been taking it out of a very niche conversation. That in the US, foreign policy conversations they don't tend to happen broadly across US voters. It's not an issue that's widely talked at the kitchen table, these types of things, right? And so it becomes, questions of foreign policy become very tied to the whim of whatever political party is in power, which we're seeing a sort of parallel example of in Sweden, right? That you've had this really promising commitment and building of this policy, and then it's at the whim of now a very different political view. And I think the question for us, so it's not really an answer to this question, but the question for us is, how do we integrate these things outside of niche conversations. So not just foreign policy, but as you're saying, domestic policy. How is this, which doesn't mean we have to do all the things at once or we can't win, but how are we having these conversations together so that if there is a change of government, we're not just left on our own, because the only sort of champions we brought along happens to be the 6 people who are of a certain party in a certain place, right? So I think this is one of the fundamental challenges for us, is how are we building feminist foreign policy conversations that are sustainable because they transcend questions of who is in power at this particular moment, or they address the question of how do we actually think more holistically about why not just the world outside of us needs this framework, but we need this framework. So again, it's not a real answer to the question, but I think it points to the central challenge, which is how are we making sure we have tangible goals with feminist foreign policy, right? So we're not going to abandon those, but as we're moving forward, having those parallel conversations to help inoculate feminist foreign policy from the whims and changes of government, which are going to come, which are coming, right, and are here in many spaces. So how do we depoliticize equity and human rights? I mean, that's obviously the question of our time, but I think that's one of the challenges and one of the disappointing, but I think very predictable things that's happened in Sweden with the change of government, right? So if you have a much more conservative party take power, and this question of feminist foreign policy or gender equity or human rights has been pitched, and in a political battle, like that's going to be the fallout. So I don't have the answer, but I think that is the central challenge to thinking about these trends, again, which I'm wary of identifying, but what is it that makes, Mexico's case right now successful is something we like, will it be successful in 10 years? Can it address the big challenges it's facing in its moment? Is with the Chile's moving forward, how is it successful now, and how can it build to continue to be successful, looking at these other examples and challenges?
We often have problems when we talk simply about foreign policy as opposed to domestic policy, because for decades, everyone acknowledges that that distinction between a domestic policy and a foreign policy no longer really is in an interdependent globalized world is irrelevant, and yet we stumble on those words and having to reconsider and rethink what those categories are. So if I may, why don't you take the next step?
Yeah. Well, following all that they've remarked, I mean, foreign policy trails, geopolitical realities. And I certainly believe the Libyan case is quite unique in that it was born out of the UN peace process, right? But even at that point, about 80% of all those involved in the negotiations to end, the political turmoil or just find resolutions in Libya were men. So, and I guess the reason why we saw that kind of development in a place like Libya is because the foreign minister is a woman, and a lot of the effort to center the conversation around feminist foreign policy came out of her, came out of her presence in that environment. But we ask ourselves, so what if her as a central figure was not in the middle of that? I doubt we would be talking about Libya in this room. But then it was passed. But also the outcome of that was there were a lot of protests that followed for many months against the new approach of the feminist foreign policy. And she also became a target of a lot of abuse, harassment, and their justification was that Libya is not a religious state, but the feminist foreign policy was fundamentally working against Sharia, which Libyans are predominantly Muslims. So this is to say that from that angle, you can see that there is a lack of wider consultations, right, within the Libyan state. And that begs the question whether or not feminist foreign policy as an instrument would then be sustainable. Like you said, in 5-10 years, she would be out of that position, most probably. Would that still be the conversation that is being had? But ultimately, the fact that in where Libya is now, I guess one of the most turbulent countries in the world, to be talking about a feminist foreign policy is also a step forward, even though the context to Canada or Chile, for example, it would be very different because their focus, right, is achieving peace at the very forefront, disarmament, um, security sector reform. So these are some of the issues that would pervade the conversation, rather than issues that I think in many countries, especially in Africa, would like to see gender pay, and care work, and all of that as very secondary issues, which I do not agree with, because these are things that affect real people, that affect women, in real time. But then they become secondary because many of these parts are conflict ridden, right? When there are no jobs, when gender-based violence is pervasive, when you're talking about child soldiers and women being kidnapped, women and girls being kidnapped, some of these issues take a backseat. So, and this really brings us back to the question of contextualizing, localizing these policies, right? Creating synergies between the international and the local, when in terms of how a country interacts with a global north country, for example, like Canada's foreign policy, how it interacts with any of these countries, the context in which these policies are being implemented, has to be at the forefront of discussions, because only then do you move beyond that point, to localities being able to curate and design the policies that also suit the local context.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I guess I'm also going to follow up on everything what has been said before. That's the privilege of being the last speaker and the last person to answer the question. And I do agree that foreign policy goes from what's happening internally in the country, and it still has the roots from the domestic policy. And I think that's how we can sort of explain that some countries are having the pushbacks, others are moving forward. And I might even disagree there is global north and global south, because we were just presented Germany is developing its feminist foreign policy right now. So I think there is no really a division that south is doing more right now and north is having a backlash. I think it's very individual still within the countries. And even if we look what they are doing, and as Fakria was saying as well, that it depends on the context and like what feminist foreign policy indeed means for every country, depending on their political situation from within. So the Germany, for instance, has a more green, more liberal government right now in place, and it's the first time the Green Party is in the government. And their feminist foreign policy is indeed becoming more progressive and trying to look a bit more outwards and having this momentum when they can do this. In other countries, for instance, I think it's on the vice versa, when the countries, when you can't stand anymore what is happening in your country and you have to do something. And yes, maybe it's not that much feminist foreign policy, but here I mean in Iran, Afghanistan, and even my own country, Ukraine, we don't have feminist foreign policy. We don't talk about feminist foreign policy. I tried to Google before this panel if there is any article actually feminist foreign policy Ukraine. I didn't find much, at least not by Ukrainians. But like what is happening right now in our country, it of course affects how women are being positioned, which policies are being passed. So we we haven't developed what feminist foreign policy means for us, but I think the situation on the ground forces you to push forward and to actually start implementing those things which are the components of feminist foreign policy, which are the components of women, peace and security. So for example, in Ukraine, women in military were allowed to serve as officials, as soldiers on the front line and in war as of 2018, which is 4 years ago. And crazy if I just named you that right now we have 50,000 women, and we also have women already being the generals and at the higher level. But then when you talk to some Western countries, and I know because I have been doing the research, they tell us, oh, sorry, we cannot have women at the top level positions because they don't have experience of 30 years, which is required by official military standards and so on and so forth. So we have countries that move the agenda forward in theoretical way and trying to design what it means. And then we have countries which might not put the name of feminist foreign policy out there, but are actually already implementing and moving forward with a lot of things just because they were forced to do so, just because that the reality requires you to. So indeed, I think that it's not, and yet again confirming the fact that one blueprint does not, on one policy does not fit every country. And we really need to look on what's happening inside and then zooming out a little to understand, I guess.
Thank you. Lots of different impressions, things to discuss. Let me take 1 or 2 questions from the audience if you wish, or comments. I know that there are 6 other fellows. If you have any impressions or things, we would love to hear from you as well, your own experiences. So if anyone has a question to the panel, or any comments that you'd like to make? Yes, please.
Hi,
And stand up and introduce yourself.
I'm Candy. I'm from South Africa. I wanted to find out, maybe for discussion, I think there is a trend with global inequality and neoliberal policies. I mean, what we saw in Chile was the kind of relationship between protests against neoliberal inequality coupled with gender-based violence, and now these two issues intersect. And I do think that in global South context, where there's high inequality, high unemployment, deep poverty, that women are the first to rise up against these issues because they are the most affected, and then become targets as women human rights defenders. I do think there is that distinction there between North and South, and the backlash that happens in the North when it comes to feminist foreign policy. And so I'm wondering about, as you were saying earlier, about the fact that in domestic contexts, people are doing the work initially, and because of the limitations in rights-based frameworks at an international level where they are state-centric, that the synergy required between international and domestic is quite difficult to piece together. And that's also because of the fact that citizens are so far removed from international fora. And so how do we get to a point where you are able to say to your representatives, this is what citizens want at a global level, and that the global debate isn't something that's far removed. And we don't repeat what's already happened with CEDAW, with the various human rights frameworks that we have in place, with the SDGs. It seems that we just kind of continue on with different policy frameworks, and yet we don't really address the issues. So I just wanted to know from the panel what your thoughts are about strategically how we can intervene at a local level to ensure that we actually do have global feminist policy. Thank you.
Yes, please.
I mean, it's such a good question. I think a lot about the way that UN processes are so removed from the work or the lives of everyday Americans who, like, many just don't know what the UN is. Half of them who do don't really like the idea. Like, that there can be, it can be so divorced in a way that's really troubling because, of course, it is meant to be impactful for people on the ground. So I think the first thing is thinking about how do we connect these multilateral spaces and conversations and terminology and processes that are deeply important and make that real to people who may or may not, if you live in Oklahoma, you might never go to New York, nonetheless see the UN. So like, why does that matter to you, right? Why does it matter to you that the United States is or is not a party of CEDAW? Like, what does that mean and why does it matter to you? And I think those are the conversations as someone who's worked a long time in foreign and domestic policy that I don't think we're always very good in foreign policy circles of like actually having that conversation back with folks who are in the domestic space. right? Like, why does foreign policy matter to you if you're the domestic person? So I think it's not just a sort of place we need to grow in our feminist foreign policy. Obviously, it is this place. There's for all those conversations. There's movements, and I'm sure in loads of national contexts as well. And I know certainly with my colleagues in other amnesty sections that the movement to get people and groups, grassroots people and grassroots groups involved in UN processes is one way. It's a very rarefied way, but having those conversations. And then the reverse is true. So one is bringing folks and helping them see the way that these global treaties matter to their lives. So, you know, in the case of the Convention Against Torture, having brought groups who were working on police torture in Chicago, right, by police against Black men in Chicago in the 80s particularly, or people who were working with survivors of conversion therapy and who live lives who don't deal with the UN, but who are brought into to show how this process actually can help bring justice and prevent further harm from people. And I think that was really effective in changing some of the conversations in the United States around police violence and torture, and also around conversion therapy, that then became really obvious to folks who hadn't been thinking about the UN or treaties or whatever, why those things mattered. The reverse, I think, is also true, which is how do we think about, you know, the US has a movement, which is Cities for CEDAW, which lots of countries have this, which is the United States, of course, is not a party to CEDAW. We're working on that, but is not a party to CEDAW, but you have specific states or localities that take the frameworks of CEDAW and then make them real to themselves. So San Francisco and California has been doing this for a long time. And like tangibly what it meant that they set up a domestic violence hotline long before there was a national domestic violence hotline. It meant that police needed to be trained in domestic violence response. I mean, there's like loads of examples. And this was a way in which like people in San Francisco, with about 700,000 people, were having conversations about UN treaties. That means they are much more likely to support and bring around these sort of more theoretical conversations. So it's that two-way street, and it's, you know, there's billions of people in the world. It is hard to have those conversations, but I think that's the work that gets done that makes it more successful, and not just like hope it sticks around if a party comes in and out of power. But I think your question's exactly right.
Anything to add to that?
No, I can follow up a little on Tara mentioned the case of CEDAW. We've seen a lot of the same thing with the Inter-American Convention on Violence Against Women, or the Belém do Pará Convention, where we've started to work over the last few years more directly with either provinces or subnational states or cities in terms of what the Belém do Pará Convention really means at a more of a local level. And that's been important, A, because nobody knew about the convention at the local level, and also because when you have something like the case of Brazil, that is a federated state and the federal government is, call it anti-rights, but you have provinces that are governed by more progressive governments, they enter into contact directly with us, and we're still able to advance that agenda despite the fact that the federal government doesn't necessarily want to work with us in its current iteration. Well, okay, it's new iteration, hopefully it does, but its current iteration did not. So sometimes it's also a way of continuing to reach people, even though the national government happens to be going through a not so progressive phase right now. So that was I think the sort of the localizing all of those international conventions is important, and we from the international sphere need to do a better job of that in terms of translating it into local, indigenous, and other languages. Simplifying the language because it's unwieldy, it's difficult to understand, trying to do a little bit more targeted communication and outreach in terms of what all of these nice rights on paper actually mean to you in your daily life. And then making sure that the services are in place in terms of, you know, if you raise people's awareness of their rights, and that's great, but if they don't have access to justice, for example, it's relatively meaningless, you know, so making sure that the services and the information and the places are in place at the local level in terms of receiving complaints and following up on them.
Some thoughts on the
I think I'd like to throw something back to the Fendi. So during this fellowship, one thing has stuck in my mind. So about foreign the FFP as a framework, is this sort of a reinvention of something new, or is the purpose to serve as an umbrella for all of these conventions, all of these frameworks that have come, you know, before the evolution of FFP, right? So, you know, are we starting over again? Or are we going back and bringing all of these very critical, important conventions, these concepts, and sort of creating, putting everything in one place so it is more comprehensive? So I would like to understand. So if you or anyone would.
I mean, I think something that we don't think about is what the implications are of global decision-making on women, right? So if you look at what happened during COVID, and I've been speaking quite a bit about vaccine equity and the implications of certain countries hoarding vaccines to the detriment of the African continent. That is an example of a failed feminist foreign policy. But what are citizens in the North doing to hold their governments accountable to say the whole world deserves access to vaccines? What are we doing when it comes to pharmaceuticals? Who say that they're going to keep intellectual property regarding vaccines? What does it mean for us as an African continent producing our own vaccines? These are all very real economic issues that are not just about, I think sometimes the problem and the challenge is that we focus on gender-based violence. We focus on gender identity. We focus on women and representation. We don't think of the implications of IMF loans on the African continent. All of these things have direct implications on a feminist foreign policy. So I do think beyond just the protest action, which is important, there also needs to be an understanding of the global political economy and how that is impacting on real life rights, whether it's environmental justice, whether it's gender justice, and to link all of these frameworks together so that we don't repeat what's already there and start to work from scratch all the time while people are getting poorer and the world's becoming more unequal. So I hope, Fatuya, that it does create an umbrella and it condenses issues, because I think global South countries also need something to monitor progress with.
I mean, maybe I'm just gonna also like summarize what I take out from everything what has been mentioned before. It seems to me like it's all about people, and like what we're talking here are about human beings, and like from some grassroots movements and some ideas and projects that are happening on the ground, which we do not necessarily call feminist foreign policy. But we also cannot put it all on those people who are trying to do the work within their communities and assume that the world is going to become a better place just because they keep working in their communities. But as you mentioned, like we should also understand like what are the global implications there, and it's kind of both ways street. So it's the bottom up approach and then the up down one. Yeah, I guess that's kind of our responsibility in a way to ensure that this exchange is happening and it's taking place. And maybe also to reply like to your question we mentioned before about feminist foreign policy, and if we change the government or we change the face there, what happens next? I think at some of the meetings we were having, my understanding was the idea is to institutionalize some things. And like we have been talking about sexual gender-based violence, access to abortions, and different components which are part of feminist foreign policy. And maybe we cannot really institutionalize feminist foreign policy as such, because that's a bit a bigger idea and not everyone is in favor of the word feminism or has any other issues. But all the smaller components, I think once they're in, once you start talking about them, once you start discussing them with people, and then you have this, that the minister announces it, and of course it's not only the minister, like it starts affecting the ambassadors levels, it starts affecting the administration, how people do the work on the ground. And even if the government changes, I do not believe like it's an automatic switch in the heads of people. Like I'm not working in diplomacy per se, but I still think like it's about people who are doing the work, and it's about this day-to-day interactions. And the more we talk about this, the more we challenge this, the more it's happening all around, and like we learn from our own mistakes, the more I think the changes are still there. And like even in countries like Sweden, it will not be a change overnight that like all of a sudden Sweden becomes the right-wing country and stops caring about gender equality and feminism. Like or maybe I'm naive and young here, but I do believe that we still center the people, and like we need to have that hope that all the work that has been done is not just for nothing.
Thank you. Yes, we have a little bit of time left, and I think I'd like to ask a final question panelists short answers, but looking forward, we need to sort of step up and say, sort of what one prediction would you have to leave with our audience on what the future of feminist foreign policy would look like over the next 5 years? And we start with you, Hillary.
Sure. I think that unless we do a better job of monitoring and evaluating the impact of feminist foreign policy, people are going to get very tired of it. Generally speaking, in the development and in the multilateral spaces, we're not good at impact evaluation. We don't really know what the results of all our policies are. And I think, if we can tie feminist foreign policy to more comprehensive monitoring and evaluation framework so that we can, in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, say Canada's or Chile's or Colombia's or Mexico's feminist foreign policy was directly responsible for the following 5 concrete outcomes. I think people are eventually going to lose interest in it. It's going to turn into a trend that will disappear as conservative governments relax their ownership of feminist foreign policies, and maybe incoming progressive governments are not so enthusiastic about the idea because what did the last feminist foreign policy really do? So I think we need to be a little bit better about impact evaluation, really sort of tying those policies to concrete results.
The overriding challenges faced in many of these issues is the data, right? It's actually disaggregated data, collecting the information that shows, evidence-based outcomes that show that in fact we are making progress. How do you measure progress is one of the things we think about a lot. Let me ask, why don't you go ahead and give your comments.
Yeah. So when I think of feminist foreign policy, I see it as a mechanism to talk to everyone, or at least a representative of everyone, because the whole basis is inclusivity. And I do believe that to an extent, that is a task that's a lot more difficult than you as a policymaker or as a government just sitting down and designing policy and ascending to it. So I believe that we will take a much longer time than just any other plain top-down approach to policy to actually, really be able to implement inclusive policies that favor the larger community, because I do think it's revolutionary that for the first time we're trying to engage everyone. We're trying to ensure that at least a majority of the population is favored by these policies that cut across many sectors and many communities, class and all of that. So I don't see it as an easy fix. I see it as the hardest fix, and so it might take longer than most other policies to create blueprints, to implement, and I am very much looking forward to seeing how all of that unfolds.
Thank you. Sophia, next 5 years, your prediction.
I think I would a bit disagree with Fakria here. And to me, it seems, and I will have a bit more global answer to the question. To me, I think the system is already cracking. Like from what I am seeing in the past 3-4 years, and I mean, I'm pretty sure all of you would agree here, like the turbulent times, like we don't really have time to rest or like recover from the crisis that happened just yesterday. And we have crises emerging, from COVID to Afghanistan to Ukraine, now Iran, and I'm pretty sure I'm missing the other crises that are happening around the world. And like, if you really go into depth, like it seems like here or there, people are fed up. And that's what I also have been talking about. A lot of people feel like they need to change something. The system that we created in the past decades are not working anymore. There should be something new there. And I think feminist foreign policy is offering this platform, indeed, as you were saying, to kind of provide the solutions, provide the decisions to do something else. And of course, we're doing lots of mistakes as we're going along, and we might be doing some things better. but we're learning as we go. And I think that once this, I mean, I don't want to impose any revolutionary slogans here, but once this system falls down, we already have something in place. We already have some ideas, and I think it might happen earlier than later. And like the momentum is now, so it's a privilege to be part of it, I think, and to be at least understanding what's happening. And I think that's something that also gives hope for me as Ukrainian, I think, and for, I hope, for other countries as well, which are not going through the easiest times right now.
Thank you. I may,
Yeah.
the last word to you, Tara.
The next 5 years, I think it's gonna be so messy, and I think we should invite that and welcome it and see it for what it is, which is progress. Because as more and more people come into this explicit conversation on feminist foreign policy, there is more space where we're gonna have disagreements, whereas different countries and contexts, and even within those, right? No country is a monolith itself, no feminist movement within a country is a monolith itself. Can you have a feminist military? Can you only have a more feminist military? Like, these are the types of questions and debates within a national context and within bilateral, multilateral spaces that is going to get very difficult and very, very messy. And I think we have to welcome that and be glad it is here, because that means that we're actually doing the hard work of trying to understand what is it that globally binds us together in these commitments? What is it that makes this work for people on the ground? What is it that came from the ground up as opposed to the top down? So that it's going to be messy. I think that, with apologies to any Argentinian colleagues, because I don't know that I'm quite getting this right, I think it's a little more of a tango than a straight shot forward, which is like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And we also need to see that, you know, I'd love it to just be guns blazing all the way to victory, but we also need to see that path is going to be, we're going to win, we're going to lose, we're going to win, we're going to lose, we're going to, not sure what that was, we're going to, you know, that this path is going to be like the movement itself, very messy, and that is how progress happens historically. That is how it has always happened, and that feminist foreign policy will be no different. So, you know, the switch of Sweden, I think, is obviously very, very disappointing, but it is not a death blow to Sweden's feminist foreign policy. It is not a death blow to foreign policy conversations at all. Like, we are in this for the long game, and it will move forward and then back a little, but we will keep moving that forward. So the prediction is such an easy prediction because it'll be a mess is a good global prediction. But I think for us, that's a very promising prediction.
Thank you. And one of the real points that have been made are the linkages, right? The discussions, the context, the debates, the kind of networking that is going to be required in order for us to be able to understand what the dynamics are, you know, where that 2 step forward go, thinking the long game as opposed to the short game. And this is one of the opportunities that we've had, especially with the fellows and with this wonderful new fellowship that the Broad Foundation has established, to begin to build those connections and to have those conversations, because we need that comprehensive understanding of where the pitfalls are, you know, how you sustain things. And this is the first step that we're going to take, I hope, in many steps with the Broad Foundation and with many other people. And I thank you very much for helping us understand some of these issues. And I hope that we will, again, have more conversations about these issues again. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you. Such a pleasure. I mean, yeah, I'm coming in sort of laterally, I'm sort of not sort of in sort of the gender, but sort of